Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today I look at the Geshelli Archel 2.5 amp. I reviewed the new E2 amp some time ago. The Archel 2.5 is a follow-up on that one, basically a single-ended version of the E2, so I was excited to get my hands on it because I absolutely adore the E2. Before I jump into the review, I just want to let you know that I've got some really exciting stuff coming down the pipeline soon, so make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. You're not going to want to miss what I've got coming, including a very special premiere of a product that I think a lot of you are going to be interested in. So make sure you hit that button. This isn't just an unsubstantiated tease to try to get you to press that button. I really have something great coming down the pipeline. I'm really excited about it, as you can probably see, so make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and stay tuned in early April for something exciting. For now though, let's talk about the Geshelli Archel 2.5. I've got two Geshelli amps here on my desk, the Archel 2.5 and the E2, and I've just got them here so you can see that they're now identical sizes both to each other should you want to stack them, and also to the J2 DAC, which is over behind me. And that's a big part of the two versions of the Archel. So the Archel 2.5 now comes in an XL version, which is what I've got here, and that makes it the full-size Geshelli chassis, if you want to call it that stacks beautifully with the E2, and also, as I said, the J2 DAC. The Archel 2.5 XL retails for $210 but do keep in mind that prices vary depending on whether you choose an aluminium case, which is a bit cheaper, but also still beautiful, or if you choose the wooden cases. This is just one variety of timber. I think from memory the wood on this is a poplar, but there are multiple different timbers available, so depending on the version of aluminium or timber and then which timber you choose, there may be some variation. But think of a starting base price at about $210. The Archel 2.5 offers many of the features we've come to know and maybe love, maybe not, that's up to you, but many of the features we've come to know from Geshelli amps. You've got the Perspex front and back panels, you've got the changeable LED colours so you can adjust it to suit the aesthetic of your desk or have no LED at all if you don't want it. We've got a couple of different gain modes, being a unity gain where basically it's just providing power, it's not amplifying the signal any louder compared to what comes from your DAC, or 6 times gain, which will make it twice as loud. Now if you're not familiar with gain, it can be a bit confusing. All you need to know is you've basically got low gain and high gain here. Something else that we've got on the Archel 2.5, which is also on the E2, is a preamp output. So you can now use this to drive active speakers or a different amplifier down the line. It's a variable output, but do keep in mind that there is no switching included. What that means is when you plug your headphones in, it doesn't switch off the output on the back, and it also doesn't have a switch to allow that. And I mentioned this in my E2 review. As much as I love the E2 and now also the Archel 2.5, as I'll explain in a moment, I don't like the fact that you can't switch off the preamp output. I really hoped that at least with the Archel 2.5, they'd be able to build in a 6.3mm switching socket, meaning that when you plug in your headphones, it switches off the rear outputs, but that's not the case. So you kind of have to think about both of these amps as either a preamp or as a headphone amp, unless you've got some convenient way of switching off your external amplifier or your active speakers. So for me, that's a bit of a drawback. It does make these not really effective as preamps because I want them predominantly as a headphone amp and the preamp function comes second. But if that setup works for you, that's fantastic. It does have the capabilities. So let's take a quick tour of the 2.5 XL. I've got the E2 here, but we're not really talking about that today. I just wanted to show that it now could make a wonderful stack if you wanted both a single-ended and also a balanced amp within the same aesthetic. But we're just focusing on the 2.5 XL, so let's go for a tour. On the front of the amp, it's very, very simple. We've got a volume control over here. We've then got a 6.3mm output and 2 simple buttons. One button is the input selection, I'll show you the inputs in a moment, and it also can be long pressed to change the gain. The other button is the power button, which long presses to turn the unit off. It's a short press to turn it on when it's in the off state. but then there's also a short press once it's switched on to cycle through the different LED colours. Other than that, there's nothing you need to control. You just plug it in, turn it on, and away you go. On the back panel, we've got a 12-volt power input. That's a standard these days from Geshelli. It's become an expected part of what they do, is they use a simple, compact, wall-watt power supply that performs pretty well. Geshelli Labs don't recommend using other power supplies because obviously it's been designed specifically with their power supplies in mind, so you may not be covered by warranty if you start playing with power supplies. But in my experience, if you're willing to take the risk of going with a different power supply, you can get slightly better sound with a linear power supply should you choose to use one. And assuming it's a good quality supply, of course. I've done a whole separate video on linear power supplies, so check that out if you're interested. I'm not going to cover it in detail here. Moving on from the power input, what you might notice is that even though this is a single-ended amp, we've got XLR inputs, and then we've got two sets of RCA sockets. One of these is the preamp output, the other is the analog input. So one place that the Archel 2.5 is different from the E2, and let me actually turn the E2 around. The E2 only offers you XLR inputs and XLR outputs for its preamp, whereas here we've got both XLR and RCA inputs available. So it's a bit more versatile in that regard. You do have more flexibility as to the DAC that you might want to feed the Archel with, or for that matter, you could run two different DACs at the same time and switch between them. So it's a really nice feature, and it does, as I said, make the Archel 2.5 just a tiny bit more flexible than the E2. But it's still a very simple amp, and I mean that in a positive sense. It's very no frills, you plug in your sources, you switch them on, you turn up the volume, and you enjoy great sound. Before I talk specifically about the sound though, let me talk briefly about power and the ability to drive multiple different headphones, earphones, etc. from the Archel. And I should mention, if you want to know why it's called the Archel and why the E2 is the E2, check out the interview I did some time ago now with Gino and Sherry from Geshelli Labs, where we talked about the names and where they came from. It's quite a fun little story. Talking about the Archel though and its ability to drive headphones and earphones, the good news is that it's got plenty of power available, having 2 watts available at 32 ohms, and I had no problems at all driving everything from low impedance planers all the way through to 300 ohm plus dynamic driver headphones. So as for headphones, it should drive pretty much anything at all. It does even drive the Susvara fairly comfortably. I'm not recommending it as an amplifier for the Susvaras in terms of its overall quality. We're talking a $6,000 headphone with $210 amp. That's not a combination I recommend. But it's not from lack of power, it's just the quality of the amp is not a top tier flagship quality, and it's not meant to be at the price it's pitched. Coming back to normal type earphones and headphones though, as well as driving all sorts of headphones, the Archel is also really good at driving IEMs. The channel balance on the volume pot is excellent. The volume starts at about 7 o'clock being 0, and by 8 o'clock the channels are coming into balance. So you've got lots and lots of range with full channel balance, meaning that you haven't got a slightly different level between your left and right ear, and on top of that it then means that you've got enough room to play that you can get a comfortable listening level without being on the border of jumping into really high and uncomfortable listening levels. So basically everything on paper in terms of features, functions, versatility of the Archel is fantastic, with the one exception of the preamp not being switchable. But everything else is excellent, and then of course it comes down to how good it sounds. Talking now about sound quality, the Archel 2.5 is very similar to the E2 in many ways, and when I listened to it in isolation, what I was hearing was a clean and articulate amp with just a touch of smoothness to it. Staging is mostly left to right rather than having much depth, but it's all nicely presented. Because there was nothing particularly standout about its sound, and I mean that in a very good way, I thought it was better off to actually start comparing it to other amps to really put it into context as to how neutral or warm it might be. And the most obvious comparison is the one that I've got right here on my desk, being Geshelli Labs' own E2 amp. So we're basically talking about the balanced version of this amp circuit to the single-ended version of this amp circuit. When you're buying the E2, you're spending an extra $20 only to get a fully balanced setup, whereas just to remind you, if you're buying the Archel 2.5, you're still getting the ability to have balance going in, but it's only got single-ended coming out. If you've watched the channel for a while, you'll know that I often talk about the fact that there is no inherent benefit in driving headphones balanced. It's an option that you can use. Often a balanced amp will sound best balanced because it's been designed and optimized for that, but in the same way, when you buy a single-ended amp, it's optimized for single-ended and will normally perform about on par. I have to say I was pretty surprised when I compared the Archel 2.5 and the E2. I was surprised at just how similar they are. Once I matched the volumes between the two of them, it was almost impossible to distinguish which one was which. Not quite impossible, but very, very difficult. The key differences I found was that the E2's soundstage feels like it's just a little bit further away from you as a listener, and the Archel 2.5, as part of that staging and presentation question, also puts the mid-range just a bit closer to you. So it's not that it is more mid-range focused tonally, it's that it spatially has more of a presence of the mid-range. And I think what's actually going on is that the E2 probably produces a slightly better sense of left-right separation, therefore it spreads the image more across the soundstage, whereas with the Archel 2.5, it's a little bit more conical probably, in the sense that your central mid-range, so your vocals, instrumentals, etc., are just a little bit more focused in front of you, and then everything else just drifts out a little bit to the side. So, as I said, it's not about a tonality difference so much as a presentation and a staging difference. Ultimately for me, having played around with both of these, what I see is that these are two amps that are 100% interchangeable. You should choose the one that you want based on your setup, whether you want single-ended preamp output, whether you want single-ended headphone output, or whether you want balanced headphone and or preamp output. That's the decision. It's not about sound quality, it's about the output that you want. And in the case of the Archel 2.5, if you want the versatility of running two different DAC inputs. The other option, of course, which is fantastic, is buy both and stack them. You've got two identical amplifiers, one being single-ended, one being balanced, and you know that whichever one you're plugging into, you're getting the same exact sound quality. That's absolutely fantastic. So bravo to Geshelli for making two amps that are so closely matched sonically that you don't have to choose between the two in terms of which sound you want, just the functions. But having said that, as much as I have raved in the past about the E2, I haven't put this into context with anything other than Geshelli's own products. And so looking through my collection and the amps I've reviewed over the years, the most obvious comparison I could find to the Archel 2.5 was the Schiit Asgard 3. This is also single-ended. In this case, it's fully discrete, whereas the Archel 2.5 is an integrated design, meaning it's using chip-based op-amps. The Asgard 3 costs about $40 more, but it does give you preamp switching, which is nice, and it's also modular, so you can build in cards like a DAC card on board, or you can have a phono preamp stage on board. So it's got a little bit more versatility. It's also a different design depending on what you prefer. But both amps are excellent, and it's going to come down in some cases to which one you prefer the sound of. What I heard when I compared the two was that the Asgard 3 is a clearly warmer amp. It's not vastly warmer, it's not this huge thick monster, but in comparing the two, the Archel 2.5 is definitely a more neutral sounding amp, even though it's still got just a touch of smoothness and warmth. And what I mean by that is it's not analytical and sterile and cold, but it's still very, very neutral. The Asgard 3 is also quite different in the sense that it produces a more three-dimensional soundstage compared to the Archel 2.5, and it's also a little bit more forgiving. It's a slightly smoother sound, that being the Asgard 3, and so for some people, if you've got a particularly aggressive headphone or maybe a particularly cool sounding headphone and you want just a touch of warmth, a touch more smoothness, the Asgard 3 might be preferable. But if you're after something that's more neutral, has a bit more sense of clarity and detail retrieval, that's where the Archel 2.5 might be a better choice. So in my mind, you're basically trading off in two different continuums. You've got the smoothness versus clarity continuum, where you've got Asgard 3 is smoother, more clarity is coming from the Archel 2.5, and then you've got the soundstage presentation. You've got a flatter, wider soundstage from the Archel 2.5, flatter meaning less depth, and then with the Asgard 3, you've got a more three-dimensional and spacious sounding soundstage. So it really depends on which combination of those is your preference and your priority. To help put this more into context though, let me give you a specific track example that you could go and listen to and work out which one you would prefer as the presentation of this track. The track I'm using here is Clocks by Coldplay and Rhythms Del Mundo, and what I heard in listening to this track from the Archel was the vocals were quite close to me, but very nicely focused. The horns in this recording were very clearly in each ear only. There wasn't a lot of horn action going on in the front. It was all direct into the left or the right ear. I also found that the backing vocals were similarly separated into just left and right ear only, and they felt like they were a bit closer to me than the horns. So if the vocals were here, the backing vocals that is, then the horns were just a step further out. Finally, things like the guitar, the bass, the piano, those all hovered around the centre, around the vocalist. There wasn't a huge amount of space between everything, but it was all very clearly defined. I've already covered off the general tonality, which is to say that the sound from the Archel 2.5 was articulate and clear, but still also nicely smooth and organic as well. Not smoothed over, just not dry or grainy or harsh in any way. Moving over to the Asgard 3, listening still to the same track, what I heard was vocals that were now a bit further away from me, but still with the guitar, the bass, the percussion, the piano, just hovering around those vocals, so it didn't separate out more space within the mix between the Archel and the Asgard 3, it just pushed it a little bit further away from me because there was now a greater sense of depth in the soundstage. For example, I felt like the piano was now a bit further away from me and therefore further behind the singer than it was with the Archel 2.5. Again, the Archel didn't sound congested. It's just that the Asgard 3 opens up the soundstage and provides a little bit more space overall. Interestingly, things like the backing vocals and the horns were still very much left-right, so that's clearly in the mix. It's not a function of the way the Archel does the sound, it's just the way the track's recorded. And so other than the sense of space that the Asgard 3 was bringing me on this particular track, and I wouldn't necessarily say it was better so much as just different, the only other thing I was hearing was that the Asgard 3 was also just a little bit more smooth, maybe a touch more organic, although that word is a pretty nebulous word, it's hard to know exactly what we're trying to say there. So what I'd say is it's just got a smoothness and a sort of sense of a more natural presentation, as if you're in the room with the musicians. Having said that, it's going to depend a lot on your preferences. Whilst I do lean ever so slightly to the presentation of discrete amplifiers and the sense of space and depth that they produce, it's not to say that that's necessarily the best presentation. Some are going to prefer what the Archel 2.5 does because it brings everything a bit more forward. It brings it all more into focus for you, so you're going to hear more of the subtle details in the mix because they're not hidden behind other layers. The Archel 2.5 doesn't fall into the trap of some other integrated amps where it jams everything at you in this kind of aggressive wall of sound type approach, but it is still more of a flat left to right soundstage. Thankfully though, it's delivered in a very natural way. So for me, if I was choosing between the two, I probably would err ever so slightly for the Asgard 3 because that's my personal taste. But having said that, there would be times and there would be certain headphones where I think the Archel's more truly neutral sound would be of benefit and a preference for me. And so I'm going to keep this review pretty short and say that I think the Archel 2.5, just like the E2 before it, is an absolutely outstanding bit of gear. It goes essentially toe-to-toe with the Asgard 3 and is for me just a question of preferences rather than better or worse. And if you've watched any of my other reviews of things like the Rebel amp and various other integrated design amps that I've put up against the Asgard 3, you'll know that anything that can compete with the Asgard 3 will easily compete with other amplifiers costing significantly more. Whether it's $300, $400, $500, I do think the Archel 2.5 is going to stack up just as nicely against those sorts of amps as the Asgard 3 does. So I'm going to keep it pretty short and just say, if you're in the market for an amp, if you like the Geshelli styling and their form and function and things like that, the Archel 2.5 is a great choice. If you've got yourself an E2 and you wish you had a single-ended output, just go and get yourself an Archel 2.5, stack them like I have here, and you've got all bases covered. I think Gino over at Geshelli Labs is working some absolute magic at the moment with both the E2 and the Archel, and it's great to see a very affordable amp with a very unique aesthetic that provides such great sound as well. So I want to say a huge thanks to Gino and Sherry for sending me the Archel for review. I think it's a wonderful amp. It's a hard call for me whether I like the E2 or the Archel better, because I do like the Archel's versatility, but I do tend to have most of my headphones wired for balanced, just because you can always go from balanced down to single-ended, but not the other way. That said, being spoiled for choice is a wonderful thing, and so I'm going to close this off with a strong recommendation for the Archel 2.5. If you're in the market for an amplifier around about that $200 mark, I think this or the Schiit Asgard 3 are two of the very best options you can buy. So I hope this has been helpful for you. I'll put links down below through to Geshelli if you're in the market for an amp. For now though, if you found this review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, hit the like button, and let YouTube and me know that you want to see more videos like this one. And also don't forget to stay tuned in April for that very, very exciting premiere that I've got. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.